The perspective of Keith Richards on John Lennon. As a result of the band's supporters having separate attitudes, styles, and musical preferences for the most of the period, they were able to keep a competition between the bands continuing for decades. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles were the two most influential rock and roll bands to emerge from the United Kingdom in the early 1960s. Both of these bands were crucial to the evolution of the rock and roll music genre. In order to attract more people's attention and boost newspaper sales, the media fabricated a significant portion of the rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Although there was some inkling that the two bands would eventually compete with one another, the Beatles were the ones who suggested the Rolling Stones to Decca Records. Even though the Beatles were more well-known and had more songs that peaked at number 1 in the UK, the Rolling Stones had their fair share of hits and scandals as well. Keith Richards, guitarist for the Rolling Stones, was one of the many members of both bands who constantly discussed the other's music. Over the years, Richards has been vocal about his admiration for the Beatles, in particular the late guitarist and vocalist John Lennon. Despite early efforts by the press and fans to generate some kind of rivalry between the two bands, the members of both British bands were pretty close. In fact, the Beatles helped the Stones gain their first success and a record deal. This was despite the fact that early attempts were made to incite some kind of competition between the two bands. Keith Richards, who is known for being a truthful guy and always expressing his honest view on other bands, is credited with having stated in the past that the Beatles are among the finest bands of all time. In 2008, Richards and Mick Jagger took part in a project with YouTube called Living Legends, in which they answered questions posed by their respective followers. The guitarist named the Fab Four as one of the 4 bands that, in his opinion, are among the very best bands that have ever existed. He mentioned the Beatles, rather obviously. I suppose you could say that I just tossed them in there, but you get the point. Richards was good friends with John Lennon, a member of the famous Liverpool band, and they spent a lot of time together. Richard opened out about his feelings on the late Beatle in an interview he gave in 2004 for the website Ask Keith, which included a one-of-a-kind series of questions and answers. He admitted, "I used to hang out with John quite a bit back in the day. He was completely outrageous. I mean, he was simply a great spirit. He certainly did not deserve that, being killed." I suppose that as time passes, more and more of us are going to find ourselves asking, "What the hell am I doing here?" in the vein of Graham Parsons, George and John, do you see what I mean? As I often say, the good die when they are young. I have a feeling that John used to visit me simply so that for one night he might pretend he was a member of the Stones rather than one of the Beatles. Like to act in an outlandish manner, you know, both laugh. "John, if you could just sleep in front of the toilet tonight, everything would be okay, right?" That's pretty much how it was, if you think about it. We were just really good friends, and he has a free spirit about him. A year before, he had also written about the Beatles on his website, recalling the beginning of their connection and describing how it had been at the time. He stated that they always got along well with one another and that both bands would talk with one another before releasing new songs in order to ensure that their releases did not interfere with one another's. Keith mentioned that John was an especially close buddy of mine. There are certain stories that simply can't be shared laughter. We had Paul, a wonderful songwriter, and Ringo, what a person, what a steady beat. George was a really nice guy. They came in order to see us play. Our gig took place in a bar, specifically at the Station Hotel in Richmond, where we were performing. It was the only one that we actually had available. Everyone present appeared to be having a wonderful time. After turning around, I see 4 individuals dressed in black leather overcoats standing there. This took place not long after Love Me Do. In addition, he stated, I mean, this was really early on, and this is early on in the 1960s. From that point forward, we are always excellent friends. When George's new single was ready, we would make sure that our schedules didn't conflict with his since back then, it seemed like every 2 months you were required to release a new single. We agreed to work together with one another. So we won't engage in a head-to-head competition, because if we did, it may give the impression that you guys are either the Beatles or the Stones, which is nonsense. However, because we are so alike, that statement is not accurate. That was something that was obvious to all of us, and it was one of the many wonderful things about it. I'm trying to say that between the two bands, there was never a feeling of competition, rather, there was cooperation.